Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm Debbie Friedman, the Executive Director of Community Legal Services, and thrilled to be here tonight with our partners from the Pew Charitable Trusts. Debt is an issue for many Philadelphians, and today we are here to talk about it and hopefully talk about it in some new ways. When Philadelphians are dealing with debt, they experience financial crisis, housing instability, intergenerational financial vulnerability. In Philadelphia, people are burdened by credit card debt, high cost loans, utility bills, rental housing costs, and unable to keep up with their regular monthly expenses, let alone pay down debt. It can feel like there is no escape, and many people feel very alone with this debt. Although many Philadelphians are in debt, often because they must borrow to pay for basic necessities that their families need, there has not been a larger conversation about who is most affected, about the systemic causes of debt, and the impact debt has had on people's lives. Research from Community Legal Services and the Pew Charitable Trusts, shows that low and middle income Black and Hispanic households are often hardest hit by debt. Today, we are going to learn more about this new research and ways that debt is harming Black and Brown communities in Philadelphia. CLS and Pew are thrilled to have Amadee Braxton of WURD-FM moderating this event and also hosting an event for us last week. And we are so glad you can join us for this really important discussion today. Thank you to the fantastic panelists you're going to see tonight and to all of the team that worked really hard to put the technology and the publicity and everything necessary to make this event a success. And with that, let me throw it to Amadee.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this really important conversation. As Debbie mentioned, I am a host on Friday's show on WURD Radio called Solutions, 5 to 7 p.m. every Friday. And on that show, we like to talk about solutions to the issues that communities in our region and the world are facing. And so I think tonight we are going to hope to get to some solutions, but we're also going to dig into the nature of the problems with the different kinds of debt that people are experiencing in the city. So without further ado, I'm going to just dive into our panel because we have a great panel of 5 people who are experts in different areas of debt. And what we'll do is for the first hour of the conversation, we're going to be hearing from the panelists one by one. And we are going to invite you, if you have questions for the panel at this time, you could put them in the chat, but there will also be an opportunity starting at 6:30 to get into deeper dialogue and small group breakout conversations. And each of the panelists will be in those breakout groups. So you can, be in direct conversation with them there if we can't get to your question in this large group conversation. I will give a shout out to all of those watching on Facebook Live right now. We invite you to also post comments and things in the chat feature there. And I'm excited to get this conversation started. So I want to start with introducing Rashida Phillips to get us kicked off. Rashida is from Community Legal Services and is the managing attorney of housing policy at CLS. She provides legal advice and representation to tenants facing housing insecurity and advocating locally, statewide, and nationally for access to safe, healthy, affordable housing and protection of tenant rights. And Rashida, housing is a huge issue, particularly when we've seen such a crisis in housing during COVID with a lot of people having loss of income. So talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing and also how there's this narrative of personal responsibility that is very connected to debt and people who are, struggling with debt. Talk about the realities of that in terms of the work that you do with clients facing eviction and all of the work that you've done advocating on this issue.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to share my screen. I have a brief presentation.
Great.
Yeah, so you know, as you shared, you know, there's a lot of issues at the intersections of rental housing, race, and debt in Philadelphia. And so we live in a city, you know, that has a high rate of substandard housing conditions. We live in an old city. A lot of our homes were built before the 1940s, and for various other reasons due to disinvestment across time. You know, thousands of Philadelphians live in substandard housing conditions, and our city actually ranks higher than the national average with housing with moderate to severe physical problems. Why that's significant in terms of debt is because costs resulting from living in substandard housing, things like medical debt, the money it costs to make repairs on a roof or to a basement with mold, things like that, having to take time from work to wait for license and inspection, having to go to court, paying money for, you know, temporary accommodations in a hotel. All of these things put really significant strain on a family's ability to be able to pay rent. We also see families withhold rent, which they're legally allowed to do in Philadelphia if they're facing substandard conditions. You know, they should not be paying rent on housing that, you know, is not healthy and habitable. However, what that often results in is eviction filings for money, you know, for the same amount of money that they've been withholding. In 2019, we saw non-payment of rent accounted for 89% of all housing cases filed in landlord-tenant court, and cases were filed for an average of $1,826 in rental arrears. And, you know, while that's a lot of money, you know, it's really interesting that in our society, for less than $2,000, a family can be made homeless, and that homelessness follows them and harm, you know, puts them in a cycle for the rest of their lives. And then in 2019, we saw about 5% of cases were filed for rental arrears of less than $200. And that number may sound low, right? But that represents hundreds of cases. When you look at that, we have an average of 19,000 eviction filings in our city each year. You know, that's thousands of cases where less than $200 a person is evicted, and again, put into a dangerous cycle. We also see a correlation between race and evictions. Over 74% of the annual eviction filings in Philadelphia are against Black women in their families. And this is not even accounting for income, right? And so often the narrative for people is that, right, they've fallen behind on rent. We're in a poor, large city. Everybody's poor. That's why people are evicted, right? But again, this narrative does not account for the fact that in African-American communities in Philadelphia, despite income, they're evicted at 3 times greater rates than in areas than with less than 10% of the population is Black. So that really tells us that, one, we have a race problem. We also have a gender problem, as well as I talked about earlier, many people are withholding rent legally, right? But still seeing these significant high rates of eviction. The pandemic has not changed that at all, unfortunately. In fact, it's sort of deepened, as you know, the disparities and the debt that people will have following it. The number of people who are behind on their rent and at risk of eviction is about almost 400,000 households, according to census surveys. And then since COVID-19 related emergency orders began last year in March, landlords have filed to evict more than 2,760 families. Non-payment of rent accounted for 87% of those filings. 24% of filings were for 1 month of rent or less, and eviction cases were filed for an average of 3,675 in arrears. And so not only are we seeing more families having evictions filed against them for rental debt, but we're seeing higher amounts of debt accrue because we've been in a pandemic for the past year. And despite the various eviction moratoria, we're still seeing these high rates of filings and again, for very high rates of rental arrears. And just quickly to share about how COVID-19, race, and housing interact. So as you might guess, anecdotally, right, there's a connection, but we did some recent research that shows that there's a very strong correlation between these things. So most areas with elevated eviction rates fall within zip codes with the highest COVID-19 positivity and hospitalization rates. And then zip codes that have those high rates have predominantly Black renters, while zip codes with the highest rates typically have an eviction rate 3 times higher than zip codes with lower positivity rates. During a pandemic, 49% of eviction filings have occurred in majority Black communities, and then 78% of the total filings have occurred in communities of color, which tracks generally what eviction filings look like before the pandemic. But again, we're starting to see the disparities deepen and connected even further to debt. And then my last slide is just to share about, the ways that eviction records, there's the eviction itself, there's the trauma of the eviction, and again, the sort of rental debt that follows people, particularly when they're evicted for rental arrears. But then there's the record itself and how the record impacts credit, how the record impacts a tenant's ability to access housing in the future that's either affordable or that is habitable and safe for their families to live in. And so these records really just truly have consequences. And the 2017 survey found that landlords in 90% of situations conduct these background checks and and they're used in about 85% of landlords' decisions to negatively, deny a tenant access to housing. And again, the connections to race are extremely clear. These are mostly Black women and Black families who have these records and who are locked out of these housing opportunities in the future.
Mm-hmm. Wow, really devastating information there, Rashida. Particularly the second to last slide that shows the correlation between the places, the zip codes that have the highest positivity rates for COVID, also being places where you have the highest eviction rates. Just really powerful correlations that show the way all of these issues intersect. So thank you, Rashida. And when we kind of get through each panelist, we're going to come back and see if we have time to open up the conversation among all of you. I want to shift to Josie Pickens, also of Community Legal Services. Josie is co-director of CLS's Energy Unit, where she advocates for energy and water affordability in Philadelphia. She represents utility consumers in legal disputes regarding their utility service. And of course, utilities is the next big chunk of one's income that is required to live, right, aside from rent. So Josie, tell us what you are seeing in your area of work and the ways that utility debt plays a role in people's lives right now.
Sure thing. Thank you, Amadee. Are you all able to see my screen here?
Yes.
Okay, let me get this going for us. So I'm going to talk a bit about utility debt and the reality that we need to imagine solutions to prevent this debt from becoming a crisis if at the end of the month, the state and the city haven't figured out a solution to the moratoriums that are set to expire at the conclusion of this month. Our research focused on the interplay between energy and security, which is the ability to afford your energy and water cost, race, and COVID-19 health outcomes. The slide here has a lot of information on it, and we'll be releasing this report in other ways over the coming weeks, so please keep up with our website. But what you see is that zip codes in Philadelphia, with a greater prevalence of enrollment in the utility low-income customer assistance programs are also zip codes with a higher density of Black and Latinx residents. So we can see from this slide that communities of color in Philadelphia are struggling to afford their energy cost. On the far left, you see PICO accounts that are enrolled in a low-income CAP program. In the middle, you see PGW GasWorks accounts that are enrolled in the CRP program. And on the right, you see accounts that are enrolled in the low-income water assistance program, TAP. And you can see the dark orange areas show the numbers of customers who are enrolled in those programs. And then it's a little bit more difficult to see the red and green dots, which show the correlation with race. So communities of color in Philadelphia are struggling to afford their energy cost. And although this is information we intrinsically knew to be true based on who comes to us for assistance, this is really the first time where we've had this type of visual, where we're able to see in plain, just by looking at the maps of the city, that this is a reality that communities of color are experiencing. And we're encouraging the utility providers to begin to track this information so we can really focus on those communities that need targeted assistance. We also looked at COVID-19 health outcomes. And the table on the left shows you COVID-19 diagnosis. The table on the right shows you COVID-19 deaths as of December. And our researchers found that at the start of the pandemic, COVID was impacting communities of color more apparently. And as the pandemic progressed, the numbers spread out across the city. So there are communities across the city who are feeling the health outcomes. But there's still some areas where there are communities of color that are experiencing negative health outcomes. And we want to drill down to do a little more mapping so that we can show the interplay between the energy insecurity and the COVID. So that's the next step of our outreach and our collaborations. This is all very relevant because at the end of March, these moratoriums on shutoffs are set to expire. And what does that mean in human terms? So PICO has reported to our state commission that there are more than 156,000 customers who are at risk of shutoff. More than 140,000 of those are residential. There are more than $195 million in PICO arrears. Arrears have increased for residential and non-residential customers. So lots of customers are suffering. PGW, more than 163,000 customers are at risk. More than 150,000 of those are residential customers, 93 million in debt. And for the water department, more than 72,000 customers are behind on their bills and could be shut off if the moratorium is allowed to expire. And this is further complicated by the fact that the water department has just proposed to increase their rates by more than $140 million over the next 2 years. So people are already behind, and we can only imagine the consequences of an increase in rates as people try to recover from the pandemic. But we need to imagine solutions. CLS is pushing for an extension of the moratoriums. We're pushing for debt forgiveness. We're pushing for elimination of barriers to the assistance programs. And we're pushing for more energy assistance funding. But we really do hope to hear from community members about your needs, about how you are planning for the elimination of the moratoriums, and how we can work together to imagine a solution beyond the debt and the shutoffs that are contemplated.
Thank you, Josie. Another really powerful presentation, and interesting to see how the mapping is, pretty much corresponds identically to the mapping that Rashida shared. I want to shift to Laura Smith, who also from Community Legal Services. Laura is a staff attorney in CLS's Home Ownership and Consumer Rights Unit, where she works toward economic justice for low-income Philadelphians by defending against abusive collections practices, preserving income and intergenerational financial stability, and improving access and due process in municipal court. Laura, why don't you tell us about what you're seeing in terms of you know, the debt collections process, how that impacts people, and you know, drawing out any similarities or parallels with what our other presenters have already shared.
Sure, thanks, Amadee. I'm also going to share my screen. 1 second here. All right, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So like Amadee said, I'm going to talk about debt collection cases that are filed in Philly's Municipal Court. And a lot of people know that as small claims court. And we've just completed some research working with the Reinvestment Fund on exactly how these collection cases are impacting Philadelphians and specifically Philadelphians of different races. But before I get into that research, I just want to give a little bit of context, you know, to get to Amadee's point about how this is affecting people, and also so that people can understand why these cases are important and why we should care about them. I think it's a little bit less obvious to some people if they haven't been through the process. So what we have known for a while and what this research confirmed is that there's a huge volume of cases filed in municipal court, in small claims court each year, and that huge volume is largely due to explosive growth in the debt buying industry. And debt buyers are just companies that buy old consumer debts that are defaulted, meaning the person has stopped making payments. The original creditor, so for instance, the credit card company has given up on collecting on them. So they sell them for pennies on the dollar to a company that buys debts and then tries to collect for the full face value on them. So what we're looking at now is a list of the top 10 filers in municipal small claims court. And what the names in orange here are some debt buyers. So we can see that the top filers, so a company that files 26% of all cases is Midland Funding. That's a debt buyer, right? So if you look at just these top percentages, more than half of collection cases are filed by debt buyers. And we're talking about, you know, in terms of a yearly filing number, it's about 20,000 cases are filed each year, give or take. So it's just a huge volume that the court is dealing with. And what we also know from our work with CLS clients is that the debt buyers that are filing these lawsuits, they often don't have the documents they need to prove their case, right? So if they're forced to prove their case, which they rarely are, they often don't have proof of the account that they're suing on or proof that they have the right to collect it. We've observed this with our clients, but federal regulators have also found this to be true. Now, the reason that the debt buyers are still able to use the court successfully in Philly and elsewhere is that they typically win their case without having to prove anything, right? So let me just switch to the next slide here. What we're looking at now is a pie chart of the outcomes of cases in small claims court. And the gray section here shows that the plaintiff or the company filing the lawsuit wins about 2/3 of the time by default, meaning they win just because they were in court and the defendant wasn't there. So they don't actually have to prove their case to win that way. And there's a really long conversation that we could have about the reasons that the cases end up this way, but relevant to our conversation today is that there are widespread complaints of no notice to the defendant in these cases, despite an affidavit of service on the docket, meaning despite the plaintiff saying that they have served the defendant or given them a copy of the complaint. So that's how 2/3 of these cases end, okay? But there's this light blue chunk here, this 13%. That's what happens when people go to court. So when someone is sued and they go to court, they go to a room in municipal court, which is in an office building downtown, and there's no judge in that room. It's called a courtroom, but there's no judge. And what happens there is that the person who's being sued, who's typically unrepresented, they usually don't have a lawyer, has an unsupervised conversation with a lawyer for the collection company that's suing them. And usually the way that conversation ends is that the defendant essentially agrees to a judgment against them, usually for the full amount of the claim, which is unappealable. It's not a good outcome usually for the defendant. So that's kind of the backdrop here for what's going on in these cases. And when all of these different kinds of judgments I just talked about, judgment by default or judgment by agreement, they have major consequences for people, right? So once a plaintiff gets a judgment like that, they can go in and freeze your bank account and take money out of your bank account. It's automatically a lien on your home. They can make threats of selling your personal property at sheriff's sale. And you know, there's a lien on and going back to the lien on your home, this can stop you from getting a loan modification when you need one to save your home from foreclosure. So there's major effects coming out of what seems like relatively small claims. So given all of that, we asked the Reinvestment Fund to take a much closer look at how these cases are affecting Philadelphians at large, and specifically Black and Brown Philadelphians. So they looked at about 4 years of data, 90,000 case records, and because there's no race data in the court records, they used a coding analysis to estimate race based on census data, so based on address and the defendant's last name. And what they found is that Black Philadelphians are overrepresented in collection cases overall. So whereas 41% of Philadelphia households identify as Black, 49% of cases involve Black defendants. And what we're seeing on this map here shows that even, aside from Black defendants being overrepresented overall, they're also overrepresented within certain neighborhoods. And this map shows where some of those neighborhoods are. It includes some in Northwest Philly, some around Fairmount, in Point Breeze, and some in West Philly and Southwest Philly. So the Reinvestment Fund also raised some red flags about service. So they found that Black and Brown defendants are supposedly served at higher rates, meaning successfully given notice of the lawsuit, but also appear in courts at lower rates so that they get more default judgments against them. And this now, the two maps I have up now are kind of showing that. So on the left, you see the lighter areas shows where service is theoretically more higher rates of success of service. So more people are getting served and more people are getting notice in those lighter areas. But if you look to the map on the right, those exact same areas are also showing higher default judgment rates. So this is really concerning because it raises questions about how effective that notice is that plaintiffs are claiming to give in those cases. And then let me just share a couple of other things that the Reinvestment Fund found. I'm just going to stop the share. Okay. So they also found that the average claim against a Black household was for a smaller amount, but represented a larger percent of the household's income, so that it placed a greater strain on that family. And that Black and Hispanic defendants tended to fare slightly worse in court by several measures. So that ranged from the amount of awards that a judge decided, in the very small percentage of cases that a judge decides. Also the likelihood of reaching a settlement versus a judgment by agreement, the kind of judgment that I talked about before. And one thing that they found was that when a defendant had a lawyer or a legal representative, that representation acted as an equalizer, reducing the racial disparities in the outcomes that we just talked about. So, I mean, this is stuff that was happening before COVID and has continued during COVID. And it's just something that's really important, I think, for everyone to be thinking about as we know that COVID is hitting Black and Brown communities harder, and as everyone is having to rely more on credit during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Great points. Thank you, Laura. I want to keep motoring forward. I have so many thoughts that I could comment on, but I want to keep moving forward and shift to Katie Martin. Katie is with Pew Charitable Trust. She's the senior manager at the Pew Charitable Trusts, where she researches the civil legal system, city government operations, and oversees the annual State of the City report, which will be released in April. And Katie, we've heard already from our panelists some of the information about demographically how this issue affects people. What do you want to add to the picture to kind of really fill out the picture for us?
Thank you so much, Amadee. And I'm really excited to be here this evening to talk about Pew's newly released research on the municipal court. And I'm really going to touch on two topics this evening. So first, where do small claims defendants live in Philadelphia? And then secondly, what were their experiences before they came to court, while they were in court, and then after, what were the consequences and the outcomes of their cases? So Pew, we're examining municipal court for a few reasons. So the first is, this is the people's court. It's the lowest jurisdictional court in the city, and it's the most number of Philadelphians will touch the judicial system through municipal court, except for, of course, those who go to jury duty. It's a really important piece of the judicial system that's going to impact many, many Philadelphians, a high volume court. Secondly, with the pandemic, many more Philadelphians are experiencing issues with unemployment, debt, and financial insecurity. Pew, we performed a survey of Philadelphians that was released in October that showed that 32% of Philadelphians say that they or members of their household have fallen behind on credit card bills and other bills since the pandemic began. Small claims court, again, was already a high volume court, and we're likely to see more cases in the years to come. So I want to share my screen for a second. To begin, these small claims cases, they're filed for amounts that are less than $12,000, often much less than that, less than $5,000. And defendants in these cases are most likely to be individuals who are being sued by businesses and creditors over allegedly unpaid debts. So Pew did an analysis of defendant addresses, which included in the court data to find out where they live. So this slide, it shows the number of cases per 100,000 residents in Philadelphia by census tract. These are cases between 2013 and 2018, slightly different data than Laura had from CLS and TRF. And the largest share of the defendants live in the middle income and lower middle income neighborhoods in Philadelphia. And this includes North, Lower Northeast, and Southwest Philadelphia. There are fewer claims in small claims cases brought in neighborhoods with both the highest poverty rates and higher income areas, such as Center City, Manayunk, and Chestnut Hill. In addition to differences by census tract, Pew examined the number of small claims cases on a per capita basis by race. So in parts of the city with a high percentage of Black residents, the rate of small claims cases brought against those residents also tended to be high. And conversely, in areas with high percentage of non-Hispanic white residents, the rate was lower. So you can see from this table the differences in the number of per capita cases brought by into census tracts with high percentages of Black and white residents. They're almost exactly the reverse of each other. Census tracts with high percentage of Asian residents were similar. They tracked similarly to non-Hispanic white residents. And we didn't identify a relationship among percentages with high percentage of Hispanic residents. Next, I also wanted to take a moment to discuss the survey that Pew had performed. These were of small claims defendants who had a case in municipal court in 2018. So we wanted to learn more from people about what their experiences were in court, what brought them to court, while they were in court, what happened, and then afterwards, what were the impacts on their lives, and how did the case impact their financial situation. As you can see, overwhelmingly, consumer debt and credit card debt are why people were sued in municipal court. That was the number one reason that our respondents said that they were brought to court. 59% of respondents said they were brought to court for credit card, charge card, or bank cards. We also asked people whether or not they agreed or disagreed with certain statements about the experiences while they were in court. So 62% of our respondents said that they disagreed with the statement that both sides are treated equally in municipal court, meaning both the defendant and the plaintiff. 85% said that a defendant needs a lawyer, an attorney, in order to defend themselves in court. And only 44% agreed that it's easy to understand what happens in your case in municipal court. What these findings from the survey show us is that a lot of people in Philadelphia are being brought to court for small claims cases, and they don't have all the information that they need to defend themselves or to understand the consequences of their cases, particularly when they do not have representation from a lawyer. In our analysis, we found that 91% of plaintiffs have an attorney in a small claims case, where only 12% of defendants do. And even though you don't need an attorney in order to defend yourself in municipal court, both court data and stakeholder accounts really indicate that having a lawyer makes a very big difference. We also asked him what were their experiences after the case was complete. So 22% of our respondents said that they fell behind on other bills or had their utilities disconnected for non-payment. 16% said they went without food, transportation, or other needs in order to pay back their debt from the court case. 14% said they felt relief that the debt had been paid and that this was off of their chest. And then 39% indicated there were no negative consequences that they experienced after the case was complete. And I just want to invite everybody who's listening today, we're doing more research on municipal court. And so if you have experienced a debt collection lawsuit and want to be interviewed about your experience, you can either call or text us at 208-801-5838. We'll be doing interviews in May, and we would love to hear about your stories and your experience with the court. That's 208-801-5838. Thank you, Amadee.
Thank you, Katie. And maybe you could put that phone number in the chat, that information, so that people will have that to reference if they themselves or know somebody who could take advantage of that opportunity.
Will do. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, so we want to round out our conversation by hearing from Kimberly C. Rogers of Clarify. Kim is the program director of the Family Self-Sufficiency Program at Clarify. Clarify is a nonprofit with a mission to empower individuals to achieve financial resilience and positively impact their communities. In partnership with Compass Working Capital and the Philadelphia Housing Authority, Ms. Rogers manages a team of financial counselors that work to support PHA residents through asset building, reducing debt, and improving financial capability. So Kim, you help get people out of these situations. I mean, many of our panelists do, but talk to us about what you hear, particularly from people who are residents in Philadelphia public housing, about how they view these issues and what you see as the root causes are.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for this opportunity. I feel like I am the outlier of the group in terms of the presentations. And I was trying to share my screen, but actually I don't need to. I can go ahead without the screen share. But it's been so much information that if I'm going to ask a favor of everyone, can we just stop for a second and just breathe? Right? Like I saw a comment in the chat that is just, it's sad where it's the reality sometimes that it feels like that, like Black people are under attack. And so I just want to just take a second real quick to just stop and to breathe. But then I also want to ask you to imagine something for me. And if you can imagine really what it feels like to be trapped. And you can set the scenario in your head, whether it's trapped in a car or whether it's trapped in a burning building or trapped in a cave. With what goes through your mind when you think about being trapped? Imagine your anxiety raising and your pulse elevating and your hopes fleeting, trapped in an experience in which you lack freedom and the ability to find comfort and safety, and you feel like you can't escape. Well, too often that's the experience for the majority of our clients that come in to Clarify. What is Clarify? So we are a nonprofit organization with over 50 years of experience supporting clients through financial counseling, and specifically clients that feel trapped by debt. With over 50 years of experience and expertise, it has led us to really evolve in the scope and the mission of our work. Our new mission includes the fact that we empower individuals to achieve financial resiliency and positively impact our communities. Typically, we usually see about 6,000 individuals a year in one-on-one financial counseling, and approximately 3,800 or so in financial education workshops. And that makes something really clear to us, and that debt is a problem in our communities. Right? For us to have that level and that volume of work that we do, it is very clear that debt is a problem in our communities. But the other thing that we notice is that when you drill down on the data of who we are serving, approximately 74% of our clients are female, approximately 80% of our clients identify as minorities, and 95% of our clients identify as being from low to moderate income households, which then compounds it and says, not only do we have a debt problem in our community, but we also have a race and a gender issue in our communities that compound that as well. So why is this particularly the population that we serve? Well, we've doubled down in our efforts to serve this community because we recognize that there have been systematic and intentional traps that have been set for this community. when you do this type of work for over a half a century that we've been doing, it becomes very clear that there is no innate or internal reason for why this population is not able to achieve financial resiliency. Instead, it is really this immoral iron claw bear trap, which is the byproduct of systematic barriers, policies, and practices that have been placed as barriers for individuals that have in the past and that continue to ensnare our clients, whether it is the racial gap, which continues to be exacerbated and has been exacerbated through history by barring Black home ownership and through practices like redlining and subprime lending, whether it is hemming in minority families into neighborhoods that are disadvantaged, which also then compounds, right, the issues, because that means that real estate is often devalued, resulting in less resources for schools and for services. It's the disproportionate shackle of student loan debt for minority borrowers, the high price the high prices and food deserts within minority neighborhoods, which result then in poor health outcomes, which then results often in higher medical debt. And quite frankly, the list goes on and on. So we as an organization, we value community, and quite frankly, we value justice. We lift up our clients' voices, and we are here part of this discussion today, not because they can't speak for themselves, but because they often don't have access and aren't able to have that same equitable access granted to be able to lift up their voices. So what do we do? So we offer financial counseling through, as Amadee said, I am the program director of our of our Family Self-Sufficiency Program, which is a partnership with Compass Working Capital and the Philadelphia Housing Authority, where we support Philadelphia Housing Authority residents in building assets. We also do work with the STAR program, which is a reentry program for formerly incarcerated individuals. We are one of the intermediaries for the Restore, Repair, Renew program, which is an affordable home loan improvement program, which is backed by the city of Philadelphia. We do work around financial counseling for eviction prevention, foreclosure prevention, home buying, and then also just general financial counseling as well. I wanted to also just say that, you know, I'm so thankful for the opportunity to be here with Pew and CLS and to be a part of this conversation, because we could not be included. And what I mean by that specifically is, like, we are representing the voices of our clients, and our clients are very clear. Like, there is a debt issue in Philadelphia, and there is a gender and race issue here in Philadelphia, and the two intersect. We've seen that time and time again over our 50 plus years of experience. That is clear for us, and it's clear to be a part of this conversation, to also be able to talk about our organization and the resources, especially for those who that research rings true for, and you may recognize that you are in a debt trap and that you don't know how to get out. Our organization provides those types of counseling services in order to support individuals who find themselves there as well.
Great, thank you so much, Kim. And if you want to post in the chat if people want to use that service and connect to clarify, maybe that would be something helpful for people to see and to write down and take with them. So wow, so much has been laid on the table for us. And Kim, I also just want to thank you for encouraging us to take a moment to just breathe and pause, to allow all that had been presented even before you spoke to kind of sink in, and to paint that really visceral picture for us of what it feels like to be trapped. And anybody on this call on this Zoom who has ever struggled to pay a bill, you know the anxiety that you have, and the self-doubt and the questioning of your own worth. And so thank you for bringing that to us. What kind of strikes me from taking all of your comments together is that there really is, you know, much of the policy that has been created is shaped by this lie of personal responsibility, into when it comes to economic policy, and there are structures in our economy where debt is a money-making sector of our economy. And so therefore it is supported, and there's policies that are in place that support it. So I'm curious to hear more. And for those who didn't get to speak to the issue of like, what are some of the solutions that you think we can put forth to change these structures? Because, you know, part of it is just kind of shifting the narrative, right? Shifting the understanding that it's not a personal responsibility issue or personal failing issue, that it is rooted in our economic history in this country, which of course is rooted in enslavement and land grabs. So what are some of the other structural changes that you think are necessary in order to make a difference in this area that haven't already been mentioned or that bear repeating? Anybody want to jump in? Rashida, I saw you kind of stirring in your chair. So I'm like, Rashida maybe has something.
Sure. I'll kick it off. I mean, yeah, I think honestly, both you and Kimberly laid it out. You know, the often when we're putting forth this personal responsibility narrative, this bootstrap narrative, this individual narrative, we're completely ignoring all of the things that have gotten us here, from the sort of structural pieces of it, the things that are enduring, our values as a society and as a country, to the things that are embedded within our institutions, within our policies. You know, so I think you're ignoring all of that, right? If you talk about personal responsibility, and just, you know, the fact that I didn't show this, right? But the same maps, right, look exactly like redlining maps back in, you know, back in the day, you know, so it maps out, and these are the same communities. And, you know, if you dig into that history, as you said, I think, sure, I can talk a lot about solutions and different things that we're working on. Some things that have been mentioned around right to counsel, people having access to legal representation before they're going to court. So we've been working on some of those efforts on the landlord-tenant side as well. But Amadee, I think it's really about what you talked about. Like, we need a fundamental shift in our values, and how we see people of color and Black people, and how we treat them, and how we're treated in society. So I think it comes down to that. And on the eviction side, right, again, prior to a certain time period, evictions were really seen as, you're poor, and so that's why you're ending up in eviction court. Like, the whole narrative about, again, tenants withholding rent because they're living in conditions they should not be living in or paying any rent for. The narrative about it being a gender and race justice issue specifically, none of that was a part of it. And so we have to be very intentional about shifting that narrative in our work, through data, through reports, through op-eds, through working community lawyering approaches, working with impacted folks to share their own stories, like all of that, to be able to start to shift that narrative. Because once we shift the narrative, we can reshift our values, right? And we can, you know, reshift away from these values of intergenerational wealth, which is important. But I love how Kimberly phrases it. It's about resiliency, financial resiliency, not necessarily intergenerational wealth, right? And so when we uphold values of intergenerational health, right, when that is our foremost value, that all people be housed, not that they buy a house so that they have wealth to pass down. That's important too, again, right? But we emphasize that at the expense of people's health and wellness, and Black people in particular. So I can talk a lot about solutions, but I'll let my co-panelists jump in.
Okay, and I just want to lift up that Kia put in the chat, one of the participants, for one, the minimum wage could be raised to $15 an hour as a solution, and also canceling student debt. Biden promised that on the campaign trail, and we need to hold him to that. So I am curious about this idea of canceling debt, because, you know, I think, Josie, from some of the slides that you shared, just the amount of debt, the numbers that you shared in terms of, like, you know, I think, you know, over 140,000 people, I think it was PICO, were in arrears. All of the huge numbers, upwards of over 50,000, you know, even above 100,000 in some of the different areas of the different utilities. How do you help people get beyond that? Do you just keep them in arrears forever? what do you do to solve that problem? So Josie, if you have thoughts about that, and then anyone else who wants to chime in with thoughts about structural solutions after Josie.
I would just add in that we need to get creative and we need to resolve those arrears equitably. We need a plan for the resolution of that debt that doesn't put all of the burden on residential customers who, at every income level are really feeling the effects of this pandemic. We need to think about ways for all customer classes to contribute to the resolution of that debt, and eliminating policies that are punitive and that give people only one bite at the apple in terms of the management and the repayment of that debt. And we really have to walk away from this narrative of it's your fault. I think it shames people into silence. It doesn't acknowledge the way that that is a problem for many Americans and many Philadelphians, but that Black and Latinx community members are feeling it doubly, and they're feeling the racial injustice on top of that. So we have to walk away from this narrative of it's your fault, especially because this year, if no other, has revealed to us what an economic crisis can mean for a family, for a budget, for a career, and coming together to think of solutions that uplift everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we definitely have to get creative. Debt is really caused by not having enough income to cover your expenses. So like, how do we get creative about those expenses, and how do we get creative about helping with that income? Anyone else want to chime in from the panel? And anybody on who's listening and watching, if you have questions or comments, please post them in the chat.
I promise I'm not going to go long. I'm just going to say this really quickly because I love what Josie said around being creative, because I think sometimes we think that, oh, it's just one thing. Like there's this one silver bullet. If we just do this one thing, right, like then everything is going to be fixed. But this is a really complex situation that we're in terms of just kind of the nuances of debt, the nuances of how it intersects with race, the nuances of how it intersects with gender, understanding that it has not been accidental, right? Like that there are some intentionalities behind some of the policies that have been put forth. And so I love what Josie said around being creative, but I would also add to that, we got to be courageous. Right? Like we've got to stand up and we have to say, like, this is not acceptable in the society that we live in, where we can intentionally see that individuals are being unjustly burdened by this or unjustly trapped within this cycle and not do anything about it. So I said I wasn't going to take long, but I just wanted to throw that in there as well.
Really important point about having courage, because, I think in this pandemic moment, this is a time to remake our world. Like this is a time to really draw attention to what's not working, what hasn't been working, that is just now being revealed to broader swaths of our country in terms of the consciousness raising that has happened in this moment. And it's time to really figure out a new way of being that centers caring and centers people's health and well-being in a different kind of way. Laura or Katie, do you want to chime in with any comments as we begin to close out and shift toward our small group conversation?
Yeah, thank you, Amadee. I would just add, I think one of the most difficult parts of this research is just realizing the disparities in who is being brought to court and how it is really not equally distributed across our city. So one of the ways that we did our analysis was we compared council districts. So which council districts have the highest number of cases and the fewest number of cases, highest judgment amounts, lowest judgment amounts. And the 9th councilmatic district, which is Councilwoman Parker's district, had 12,842, which had the highest number of cases that were brought. And we're talking like Cheltenham, Cedar Brook neighborhood. The fewest number of cases were in the 5th councilmatic district, but they had the highest number, or the highest judgment amounts. So even though there were fewer cases in the 5th, which is kind of the North Philly community, they had the highest judgments against those cases. And it is demonstrating just an unequal impact that these cases are having on the residents of Philadelphia and who's being impacted by them.
Really interesting point. Laura, you have 45 to 60 seconds if you want to chime in with any final comment before we shift to small groups.
I can't possibly improve on the ideas to be creative and courageous. I think that's a perfect way to end it. I mean, like big picture, right? We need a living wage and a robust safety net so that people don't have to borrow to pay their bills and get their tooth fixed. That's like super big picture. And then, you know, on the more micro Philly level, we need people to have fair access to court and information about why they're being sued and to understand what help is out there. So that they can avail themselves of that, and for plaintiffs to win when they should win, and lose when they should lose.
Right, and to just even understand their case.
Yeah,
yeah,
that would be a good place to start.
Right. Well, that brings us to the end of our panel portion, and I want to just thank you all for presenting such rich and valuable information for us all to help us begin to think about this issue in a deeper way and shift our own narratives about it. I think, you know, a lot of people on this call are probably people that care deeply about these issues, and like me, and, you know, I've been changed by what I've heard from all of you in terms of the depth of my understanding. So really want to thank you.